The silence in the boardroom at 11 o'clock at night was the thick, suffocating quiet that happens when very expensive things are actively breaking. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing black coffee and watching the chaos unfold on my secondary monitor through a securely routed diagnostic back door. On the main screen, server logs scrolled in a cascade of red error messages. The system was down, hard down. Right in the middle of the digital wreckage sat $85 million in pending transactions, completely frozen. In the boardroom, the tension was palpable. I could see them through the security camera feed I had casually left open. Wallace Reed, our chief executive officer, was pacing the length of the mahogany table, his face a terrifying shade of plum. He was demanding to know why the crown jewel of Apex Vanguard Financial, a proprietary trading system valued at $180 million, was currently useless. Cowering at the far end were Elliot Crane, the vice president of operations, and Preston Thorne, a wildly overpaid consultant from Zenith Digital Advisors. Elliot, usually a man whose arrogance preceded him, was sweating through his tailored shirt. Preston was frantically typing on his laptop, his hands shaking. They had promised Wallace that their new automated artificial intelligence protocol would increase efficiency by 50%. For that disastrous advice, the firm had paid Zenith $560,000. Now, the artificial intelligence had predictably failed. Caught in a recursive loop, it had locked the entire database to protect itself from corruption. It was a failsafe I had warned them about. But my warnings had been dismissed. On the camera, Elliot snatched a desk phone and slammed his finger into the keypad. A second later, my cell phone lit up. The caller identification proclaimed Elliot Crane. I stared at the flashing screen, taking a slow sip of coffee. I did not pick up. After all, Evelyn Walsh, our human resources director, had sent me a legally approved email just 3 days ago. She informed me that my position was transitioned to a strict 40-hour work week. All unapproved overtime was forbidden, effective immediately to maximize operational synergy. It was 11 o'clock at night. Answering the phone would violate company policy. And I am, above all else, a rule follower. My name is Richard Vance. I am 49 years old, a senior systems administrator, and for the last 18 years, I have been the unseen foundation holding up the infrastructure of Apex Vanguard Financial. I started here when I was 31, a young guy with a knack for uncooperative mainframes. I gave this company my evenings, my weekends, and a terrifying percentage of my sanity. My wife, Melissa, is 46 and possesses the patience of a saint. She has spent 2 decades keeping my dinner warm and putting our 2 kids to bed while I responded to catastrophic server crashes. Julian is 15, navigating high school, and Sophia is 12, a fiercely independent girl who just made the middle school soccer team. I missed Sophia's championship game last year because Elliot Crane insisted on pushing a major system update on a Saturday morning. I swore to Melissa that I would never let this job steal my family time again. I built the architecture that handled the explosive growth of the firm. But to men like Elliot, I was just a line item on a spreadsheet that needed to be optimized. When he brought in Preston Thorne to modernize our department, the writing was on the wall. Preston looked at my customized server environment and saw only inefficiency. He sold Wallace Reed on a fantasy of automated perfection. I tried to explain the regulatory risks. I drafted memos detailing exactly how their proposed changes violated strict compliance standards. I cited the Delaware General Corporation Law Section 144, specifically detailing the breach of fiduciary duty in allowing unvetted third-party software to handle sensitive financial data. I even brought up the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, Section 404, outlining the severe penalties for failing to maintain adequate internal controls. They did not care. Elliot told me I lacked vision. Evelyn from Human Resources told me I was resistant to positive change, so I stopped resisting. I watched as Preston and his team of expensive consultants ripped out the safeguards I had spent years building, replacing them with a fragile artificial intelligence algorithm. And when they finally pushed the button to take the new system live, I packed up my desk, drove home, and waited. It took exactly 3 days for the system to collapse. The algorithm encountered a simple anomaly in the transaction queue, panicked, and initiated a hard lock. It froze $85 million in midair, and now they were calling me. My phone stopped ringing, then started again. Elliot was desperate. He knew his job, and possibly his freedom, was on the line. I watched him on the monitor, yelling at Preston, who was holding his head in his hands. Wallace was pointing a trembling finger at the door, likely threatening to fire them both. I took another sip of coffee. The brew was cold, but it tasted sweet. I had no intention of answering the phone. I had no intention of fixing their mess tonight. I was going to let them sweat. Because tomorrow morning, I was going to walk into that office not as a subordinate, but as the only man who held the keys to their survival. The email arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon. A sterile calendar invite from Elliot Crane, our Vice President of Operations. No subject line, just a meeting room for 3 o'clock. I wiped the thermal paste off my hands and grabbed my notebook, feeling that familiar tightening in my gut. Elliot was the kind of executive who wore expensive suits and threw around buzzwords. He was brought in 6 months prior to streamline the company, which usually meant cutting the people who actually kept the lights on. I walked into his corner office precisely on time. The space smelled of expensive cologne. Elliot leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a gold pen against his teeth. He did not offer me a seat, gesturing instead toward a printed spreadsheet. "Richard," he started, not looking up. "We are reviewing departmental expenditures. I am looking at the overtime logs for the infrastructure team, and your numbers are unacceptable." I stood my ground, keeping my voice even. "Those hours are for the weekend server maintenance, Elliot. You know the legacy database cluster requires manual load balancing when the nightly batch jobs run over. If I am not monitoring it, the system locks up before Monday morning." Elliot sighed. "Listen, Richard, you have been here almost 15 years, right? But technology moves fast. We are bringing in consultants from Zenith Digital Advisors to modernize our workflow. Preston Thorne will lead that initiative. Meanwhile, the executive board mandated a zero-tolerance policy for unapproved overtime. Effective immediately, you are capped at 40 hours a week, not 1 minute more." I felt my jaw tighten. I had spent a decade building a web of custom scripts just to keep our aging infrastructure from collapsing. I was the guy waking up at 3 in the morning to reboot a failing node so sales could log in at 8. "Elliot," I said, "you cannot just cut the monitoring. The primary database runs on hardware that is 7 years old. If you cut my overtime, I cannot run the weekend diagnostics. Without those, you risk a catastrophic failure during peak hours." He waved his hand dismissively. "We are transitioning to cloud solutions. Your experience is valuable, but outdated. We need lean, agile operations, not hand-holding for obsolete servers. If the system fails, it fails on company time. Do not log another hour unless Wallace Reed himself signs off on it. Are we clear?" I stared at him for a long moment. Looking at his smug expression, I realized he did not care about the infrastructure. He only cared about the budget he would present to the chief executive officer. "Crystal clear," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. I turned and walked out. The walk back to my cubicle felt different. Beneath the anger was a profound, icy clarity. I had sacrificed evenings, weekends, and holidays out of duty. They just told me my dedication was a financial liability. I sat at my desk and opened my terminal. I had 24 bash scripts running on a hidden schedule. These were the automated watchdogs I coded on my own time to page my phone whenever a memory leak threatened the main server. Methodically, I began tearing them down. I typed the commands with deliberate precision. I removed my cell phone number from the emergency contact registry. I disabled the automated failover triggers, built to compensate for the aging hardware. I did not break anything, nor did I delete company data. I simply restored the systems to their factory default configurations. Then I opened a new document and detailed every change. I noted the date, the time, and cited the exact directive from the Vice President of Operations regarding the cessation of all unapproved monitoring. I saved the document to the shared drive and emailed a copy to myself, Elliot and Evelyn Walsh, the Human Resources Director, ensuring an ironclad paper trail. At exactly 5 o'clock, I locked my workstation. I did not check the server loads. I left my laptop on the desk, grabbed my jacket, walked out to the parking lot, and got into my truck. The drive home was strange. Usually my mind would race with pending tickets. Today there was only the hum of tires. I pulled into my driveway at 5:45. I walked through the front door, greeted by the smell of roasting garlic. My wife, Melissa, was tossing a salad. She looked 46 but still had the same bright smile that captivated me 20 years ago. Julian, my 15-year-old son, was struggling with his algebra homework, while 12-year-old Sophia told him a convoluted story about her day. "You are home early," Melissa said, wiping her hands and giving me a surprised look. "Everything okay?" I kissed her forehead and took a deep breath. The warmth of the house wrapped around me. For the first time in a decade, my phone was not vibrating with a server alert. "Everything is fine," I said, pulling out a chair next to Julian. "Let me help you with those equations, buddy." Sitting there with my family, I realized how much of my life I had poured into a company that viewed me as an outdated line item. I had given them my youth, my stress, and my time, but they had just given me my evenings back, and I intended to enjoy every single second. Let the servers burn. I was finally off the clock. The very next week, the so-called cavalry arrived at the corporate office. They called themselves Zenith Digital Advisors, but to anyone who actually worked for a living, they were just another pack of overpaid consultants in sharp suits. Leading this circus was a kid named Preston Thorne. I call him a kid because he could not have been a day over 25, fresh out of whatever elite business school taught him how to use the word synergy without laughing. Elliot Crane, our vice president of operations, paraded Preston and his team around the floor like prized show ponies. Elliot was beaming, completely oblivious to the fact that morale in the IT department had just flatlined. I sat at my desk sipping my lukewarm coffee, watching them stake their claim on the large conference room. They unpacked their sleek laptops and immediately started drawing meaningless diagrams on the whiteboard. It did not take long for them to start tearing the place apart. By Tuesday morning, Preston and his team had gained administrative access and began ripping out the manual verification layers I had painstakingly built over the last 10 years. These were not just random hurdles, they were fail-safes. Whenever massive batches of sensitive financial data transferred between our secure internal servers and external client portals, my scripts required a human set of eyes to verify the hash totals and approve the final commit. It was a tedious process, sure. But in my 49 years on this earth, I had learned that when dealing with millions of dollars in corporate assets, you want a tedious process. You want a process that makes it incredibly difficult for a single error to cascade through the network. But Preston had a different vision. He wanted to replace my verification architecture with a proprietary artificial intelligence script his firm had developed. According to the glossy pamphlets Elliot left in the break room, this new system would streamline operations by 80%, automating the data validation process in real time. From a systems administrator perspective, it was a waking nightmare. They were taking a sturdy, reliable vault door and replacing it with a revolving door that operated on algorithms nobody in our building actually understood. The new script would pull data, run its internal checks, and push it directly to the live client databases without a single pause for human confirmation. If the system hiccuped or if the formatting was slightly off, it would just keep pushing corrupted data at lightning speed. By Wednesday, the sheer recklessness of what they were doing was keeping me awake at night. I decided I had to say something to cover my own backside. I found Preston in the break room pouring himself an espresso. I walked up to him, trying to keep my tone even and professional, and brought up the glaring legal elephant in the room. I explicitly warned him about our requirements under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, specifically Section 404. I explained that federal law mandates strict internal controls over financial reporting to prevent fraud and massive accounting errors. I told him that removing the manual sign-off stripped away the auditable paper trail our compliance officers relied on during their quarterly reviews. Preston barely looked up from his espresso. He gave me this condescending little smirk, the kind of smile you give a confused toddler. He told me that my concerns were noted, but ultimately antiquated. He insisted that their artificial intelligence model had dynamic compliance checking built into its core framework, logging every action in an encrypted ledger that far exceeded federal requirements. He patted me on the shoulder and suggested I take this opportunity to relax. Maybe learn some new skills now that my old job was being automated. The arrogance was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. He was completely dismissing decades of institutional knowledge because his theoretical model told him he was right. I did not argue. I just nodded, turned around, and went back to my desk. I had done my duty. I had raised the flag. Thursday afternoon was quiet, the kind of heavy, expectant quiet that usually precedes a severe thunderstorm. At exactly 4:45, I was monitoring the live server logs when I saw the first tiny anomaly. It was a minor synchronization error on a routing table, a drop packet of data that the new artificial intelligence script tried to reconcile by sending a duplicate batch. Then, it happened again and again. The script was looping, misinterpreting a standard firewall latency as a failed transfer, and it was rapidly beginning to duplicate financial ledgers across the external network. Because the manual verification hold had been disabled, there was nothing to stop the corrupted data from bleeding into client portals. I watched the red error lines begin to cascade down my secondary monitor. The protocol for this situation, the new protocol that Preston himself had written and Elliot had approved, stated that all network anomalies handled by the new system must be logged via the standard help desk portal for the Zenith team to review during their morning sprint meeting. It explicitly prohibited local IT staff from manually interrupting the automated processes. So at 4:52, I opened a standard low-priority ticket. I documented the synchronization loop, cited the exact server cluster, and submitted it into the void. At exactly 5 o'clock, I logged off my workstation, grabbed my coat, and walked out the front door. The system was about to eat itself alive, and I was going home for dinner. Thursday night was supposed to be my sanctuary. After a grueling week dealing with the circus at the corporate office, I finally had a few hours of peace. My wife and I had just finished a quiet meal without the constant interruption of frantic emails or ringing phones. We were sitting on the couch, watching an old classic movie. The house was wrapped in rare silence. For a 49-year-old systems administrator, genuine silence is an absolute luxury. We live our lives listening for the hum of server racks, the sharp ping of automated alerts, the quiet warning signs that something in the network is about to break. Tonight, I let my guard down. I poured a glass of aged bourbon, leaned back into the cushions, and let the stress of the past few days melt away. I should have known it would not last long. The first sign of trouble came at 9 o'clock. My personal phone gave a short buzz. I intentionally ignored it. 10 minutes later, it buzzed again. Then again and again. I picked up the device. It was a rapid string of frantic text messages from Elliot Crane, our arrogant vice president of operations. The messages started off annoyed, progressed to demanding, and ended in outright panic. Customer portals were timing out. Financial transactions were queuing up with nowhere to go. He needed me online immediately to fix it. I read the messages, took a slow sip of my bourbon, and set the phone back face down. If Elliot wanted me to clean up the mess he and his young consultant had made, he was going to have to do it by the book. I knew the company handbook better than Elliot ever would. Without an official emergency overtime authorization, signed by an executive, my intervening would be considered unauthorized access outside normal business hours. So I sat right there and continued watching the movie. My phone vibrated until I powered it down completely. In corporate America, if you touch a broken system without a paper trail, you own the breakage. I was certainly not about to take the fall for Preston Thorne's shiny new automation script. It was not until 11 o'clock that my company pager went off. I walked into my home office, booted up my workstation, and checked my secure email. There it was, an urgent authorization for double-time emergency support, digitally signed by Wallace Reed, the chief executive officer himself. Only then did I open the network tunnel and dial into the emergency bridge call. The moment I connected to the audio, the chaos almost blew out my headset speakers. It was a cacophony of overlapping voices, shouting over one another in a desperate attempt to find someone else to blame. Elliot was berating Preston, the formerly arrogant wunderkind from Zenith Digital Advisors, whose swagger had completely vanished. Preston sounded exactly like a frightened college student trying to explain a failing grade. And then, cutting through the unbearable noise with cold authority, was Wallace Reed. The chief executive officer demanded silence. And he got it instantly. The line went dead quiet. Wallace asked for a technical update. Nobody dared to speak. I unmuted my microphone, calmly introduced myself to the executive team, and clearly stated that I had just received formal authorization to investigate the network outage. I opened my diagnostic terminals and started pulling the primary system logs. It did not take long to see the massacre. The entire primary database cluster had locked itself down. It was not a random software crash. It was a highly deliberate defensive security maneuver. I kept my voice steady and professionally measured. I informed Mr. Reed that I had the live telemetry right in front of me, and the core database was not offline due to any hardware failure. It had initiated a hard compliance lockdown. Wallace asked what that meant. I explained that a massive influx of data manipulation commands had attempted to aggressively bypass the mandatory financial verification protocols. When the system detected a sustained attempt to rewrite secured tables without the legally required cryptographic handshakes, it immediately severed all external network connections to preserve critical data integrity. It did this to prevent our company from committing a federal crime under financial regulations. The silence on the executive bridge was stunning. I continued speaking, making sure every word was crystal clear. I officially reported that the direct source of these illegal commands was the automated management script deployed earlier this evening by Zenith Digital Advisors. The script was written to prioritize speed over compliance, completely bypassing the essential regulatory checkpoints. Wallace coldly asked Elliot if this was true. Elliot stammered, claiming they had tested the deployment in a sandbox. Preston chimed in, babbling about optimization algorithms. But the truth was logged in immutable text. They had foolishly tried to cut critical corners to look like corporate heroes, and instead, they had nearly torpedoed the entire multinational company. Wallace cut them both off with a single command. He instructed me to take absolute control of the environment, permanently purge the external consultant scripts, and safely restore operations. I spent the next 2 hours untangling the mess, feeling a quiet satisfaction with every line of code I deleted. I needed absolute, unbroken silence. That was my single demand when the realization of the impending catastrophe finally settled over the room. We had $85 million hovering in the digital void, tied to a corrupted verification database, schema, and the global markets opened in exactly 3 hours. If those transactional records were not properly indexed, authenticated, and restored by the time the opening bell rang, the financial cascade would not just bankrupt the firm. It would likely result in federal indictments. I locked the server room door, ordered the junior technicians to step away from their consoles, and sat down at the primary administrative terminal. My 49-year-old back ached from the tension, but this was the job. This was what 25 years in network infrastructure had prepared me to handle. For 3 hours, I existed in a state of hyper-focused technical triage. Rebuilding a verification database schema from fragmented backups requires a deep, surgical understanding of the underlying data structures. I had to manually map the orphan transactional tables back to their parent directories, carefully re-establishing the primary and foreign key relationships that Elliot Crane's disastrous vendor software had shredded. Every command line entry had to be flawless. One misplaced parameter could trigger a cascading data overwrite, wiping out our final layer of redundancy. I drank cold coffee and typed until my fingertips felt numb. Slowly, the system began to stabilize. At 15 minutes to market open, I executed the final integrity check. The console flashed a steady stream of green success messages. The database was sound. The $85 million were secured. I slumped back in my chair, exhaling a breath held since midnight, and unlocked the door. When I walked into headquarters on Monday morning, the atmosphere was thick enough to carve with a utility knife. Nobody talked by the coffee machines. Everyone kept their heads down. By 10 o'clock, my desk phone rang. It was the executive assistant for Wallace Reed, our chief executive officer, demanding my immediate presence. I took a slow walk down the executive corridor, fully expecting a grueling post-mortem. Pushing open the heavy oak door, I found an unexpected assembly. Wallace sat behind his massive desk, looking grim. To his left was Evelyn Walsh, our human resources director, clutching a thick manila folder. To his right sat a man in a sharp charcoal suit, a senior restructuring advisor from an external firm. Elliot Crane was noticeably absent. Wallace motioned for me to take a seat, wasting no time with pleasantries. He looked exhausted, yet a sharp, focused anger burned in his eyes. He explained that, while I was buried in the server room salvaging the company's financial lifeblood, their internal audit team had started digging into the procurement process. What they found shattered the arrogant facade Elliot had maintained since his arrival. The disastrous new system was not merely a symptom of incompetence. It was the result of deliberate corruption. Evelyn opened her folder and outlined the findings. Elliot aggressively pushed through the $560,000 contract because he was receiving substantial, illicit personal kickbacks through a series of shell companies. He had completely bypassed standard vendor vetting protocols, ignored my explicit risk assessment warnings, and jeopardized the entire enterprise for personal financial gain. The restructuring advisor chimed in, his voice cold and clinical. He explained that Elliot's actions constituted a textbook violation of Delaware General Corporation Law, Section 140, representing a severe breach of fiduciary duty. The hammer had fallen swiftly. First thing that morning, Elliot was called into a conference room, presented with the irrefutable digital paper trail he arrogantly assumed no one would find, and terminated immediately for cause. Evelyn described how security escorted him out of the building through the freight elevator, stripping him of his access badges and corporate devices. Furthermore, the company was filing a comprehensive civil lawsuit to recover the kickbacks and damages. The man who dismissed my decades of experience as obsolete had engineered his own spectacular, illegal downfall. With the grim business concluded, Wallace leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. His tone shifted to quiet, genuine respect. He acknowledged that my refusal to capitulate to Elliot's reckless timeline and my ability to manually resurrect the database under immense pressure had saved the company from a fatal disaster. They had severely undervalued the institutional knowledge and critical stability I provided. Then, he slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was an updated compensation and role agreement. Effective immediately, I was promoted to the position of Director of IT Operations, accompanied by a 30% raise in my base salary. I signed the paper with a steady hand. Walking back to my newly acquired corner office, I felt a profound sense of vindication. The corporate world often fetishizes disruption and the blind pursuit of the new, treating steady, reliable expertise as an obstacle. But when systems inevitably crack under the weight of arrogance and poor planning, it is the seasoned veterans, the ones who understand how the foundation was built, who are called upon to stop the collapse. I had drawn my boundaries, stood my ground against a corrupt superior, and let my technical competence do the talking. The gray hair I earned over 25 years was not a sign of obsolescence. It was the reason the lights were still on.